the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Vladyslav Havrylov. He's based in Ukraine, but also works with the team in Georgetown University, documenting war crimes. And most recently, one of the issues that's been a focus of his, but also of his colleagues, is the issue of the abducted Ukrainian children, many of whom are now being indoctrinated and militarized by Russians. We'll be discussing that today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for the important work that you do. I wanted to start by asking you, how did you get involved in this important effort, and how is this issue being handled at the moment?
Thank you, Irina, so much for inviting me and especially for introducing me. I'm Vladyslav Havrylov. I'm a research fellow at Georgetown University, and the last 3 years we still working with important topic. It's especially we investigating Russian war crimes against Ukrainian children. It's forcible deportation of children from temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to Russia. It's militarization of children in occupied territories and in Russia Federation, and especially adoption of children, Ukrainian children or children who have no parents to Russian families. And it's main topics what I'm investigating right now.
Is the Georgetown team the main team in the United States that's working on that issue?
Yes, in Georgetown University, we have collaborative of global children issues. And in this collaboration, we have a topic what considered especially in Ukrainian-Russian war. And I'm, as a researcher, investigated this topic in Georgetown University.
Let's start by asking a basic question, just for our audience to understand the situation a little better. What are the concrete stages of this process, from the initial seizure or quote unquote so-called evacuation of Ukrainian children to their placement in Russian institutions or families?
Yes, especially before full-scale invasion, what we know about from open sources and what we know especially from sources from occupied territories of Ukraine, that before full-scale invasion in 19 February 2022, ahead of so-called Luhansk People Republic, it's occupied territories of Luhansk region in Ukraine, Leonid Pasechnik, he said that they want to so-called evacuate children from occupied territories of Luhansk region to Russian regions what near Ukrainian border. It's especially Rostov region, Voronezh region, and Belgorodsk region of Russia. And after full-scale invasion, this process still going, and in all occupied towns and cities and village, Russian officials try to deport children from occupied territories to Russia. What we know for right now, that at least from identified number, it's 19,546 children are forcibly deported from occupied territories of Ukraine to Russia. But it's only identified numbers, what we know about these children, different numbers, and it could be at least thousands, hundred of children. It could be maybe more than hundreds thousands of children. It could be very big numbers, because nobody know especially numbers, how many of these children are forcibly deported to Russia. From my investigation especially, and my team, we know about at least 50 places, maybe more, maybe 60 places in different regions of Russia, where Russian officials try to replace children from Ukraine, from occupied territories in Russia. And especially after that, they try to change their names, they try to change their surnames, they improve a lot of Russification lessons for them, and in some cases, they try to adopt these children to Russian families. So it's very hard, especially after that, to come back in these children to home.
And what are the routes by which they are taken to Russia from the occupied territories?
Why they do that?
No, how? What is the routes, the roads, the pathways by which they go?
What we know from open sources, especially, that Russian officials very detailed have a very detailed plan how they prepare into this process, especially Ministry of Emergency Situation in Russian Federation. They have a list of evacuated trains from occupied territories of Ukraine to Russia, so they know about especially people from occupied territories what they want to so-called evacuate. But from this number, it's a lot of children. And children, after this replacing, they replace to summer camps in Russian Federation. It's one way. Another way, it's a big buses. Especially, they put children to bus and said to their parents that, oh, especially in your territory, it's very dangerous for children. So should you should take in these children to Russia for only for summer camps, for summer holidays. But what we know, especially after that, is that it's so many cases that they don't come back, these children, to home after that. These children stay in Russia Federation, and Russian officials have officially position, and they said we have no chance to come back these children to home because it's a battlefield, it's wartime, and we don't want to do that. And especially a very difficult situation with orphans because they put orphans children to buses and taken away to different Russian summer camps, and it's very hard to identify it, these children, to find these children, and especially to come back these children to home. So it's different ways, but especially the main ways it's deportation of children by trains and deportation of children by buses.
Have there been any instances of these trains or buses being intercepted or stopped along the way?
I know especially that how it explain after I try to like this after occupation of different regions in occupied territories of Ukraine, some of Russian governors try to try to control these territories. And it's like chief regions. They said in open sources, for example, that some part of Luhansk region controlled by Astrakhanska region of Russia, some part controlled by Saratovsky region of Russia. For example, Donetsk city and Donetsk region controlled by Moscow city and Moscow region. And especially these governors paid money for these buses and for these trains, that after that these buses come to Ukraine, to occupied territories, and taking children from occupied territories and put away to Russia. It's what I know clearly from open sources.
How are the children selected or categorized? And are there particular cities or age groups or family circumstances that are more systematically targeted than others?
I know especially that they have a high percentage of interest to boys, teenagers,
Mm-hmm.
especially boys who have already 15, 16, 17, 18 years old. Why they do that? Because they see these children like future mobilized sources for Russian army, and they have some paramilitary groups. It's like a specifically paramilitary organization created by Minister of Defense of Russian Federation. For example, Young Army. It's a very big paramilitary movement, and they try to involve in this paramilitary movement, especially boys, teenagers from occupied territories of Ukraine. So they especially include these children in two ways. First way, they include it after creating a branch of this paramilitary organization in occupied territories, and another system. It's they try to include these children to this paramilitary movement after deportation. So it's a very high percentage interest to these children. Another category is orphans, because orphans it's like a very easier way
Mm-hmm.
for Russian officials to deport these children, because they know that not so many requests after that about where these children, and after that they try to change surname in these summer camps for with orphans surname, and especially to put these children to Russian families. And so that's why orphans, what I know, and boys teenager, it's a high percentage of interest for deportation from Russian officials.
Mm. So, what happens to them immediately after removal, and how do reception facilities where they're placed before being moved elsewhere function in the first weeks or months?
I know especially that in some cases it's still working like a usual summer camps, but after that they input especially specifically educational program, and especially they input like lessons about main lessons about the general. It's a very political lessons about Russian policy, Russian history, and like Russian Federation supremacy in
Mhm.
Eastern Europe, and they try to set especially children that you are Russians, that it's very good to be Russians, and you should stay in Russia. You don't, Ukrainian don't want to come back you, and you can stay in Russia, and growing up in Russia. Educated in Russia, and like this propaganda, they flooded like this propaganda to Ukrainian children. And after that, they input especially paramilitary lessons. For example, I know that in occupied Crimea, they created a very big group of young army paramilitary lessons. They have another movement like they called movement of first. It's a similar like young army. They have young guard of United Russia
Mm.
paramilitary movement. So they have a lot of this paramilitary movement to re-educate children in these camps, and especially when these children staying in these summer camps a few months, they have a lot of these propaganda lessons and re-educational process, so it's so hard, for example, after that to have some rehabilitation to these children when
Mhm.
they come back to Ukraine, because a lot of propaganda from Russian officials flooded to these children in these summer camps.
What happens if the children are not susceptible to the brainwashing, if they resist, if they don't listen, or if they demand to be returned home?
I know about especially few cases of violations against children. For example, about physical violations, because I know about a story from children from occupied territories, what forcibly removed to occupied Crimea, and in occupied Crimea, Russian officers have a physical pressure to these children because they don't want to learn Russian anthem, and they don't want to have a participation in these paramilitary lessons, you know. So it's like a physical and mental violations against children who don't want to support this policy.
So, how are the Ukrainian language use and history of Ukraine and family narratives treated in these uh, re-education centers, and how quickly um, are they replaced with the Russian state narratives?
I know especially that in these summer camps and in temporary accommodation centers, what they creating to replace our children from occupied territories, they have no chance to learn Ukrainian language and Ukrainian history. It's a real fact because after that, after deportation to Russian Federation, they have only Russian history, Russian language, and Russian policy.
And so, is there a different type of military or paramilitary exposure, or are those programs uniform across all the Russian and occupied facilities?
I know that especially in like in occupied territories of Ukraine, they have a lot of this paramilitary movement and branch of this paramilitary movement, and it's like a all-day lessons. What they try to improve in school, in higher educational, especially in university and in different places. But in temporary accommodation centers and in summer camps, it's like a lessons with invited Russian officers, you know, with invited Russian soldiers who used to earlier who used to fight against Ukraine in this war. It's what especially I know. It's like a different practice by. It's like a different practice, but with the same goals, you know.
Exactly supervises and funds these programs, and how centralized versus regionally delegated is their implementation?
All territories of all occupied territories of Ukraine controlled by Russian officials, but especially different regions of occupied territories of Ukraine controlled by different
Mm,
um, regions. You know, it's what I'm talking about earlier, that, for example,
mhm,
Donetsk is controlled by Moscow,
mhm,
Luhansk is controlled by Astrakhan. For example, occupied territories, left bank of occupied Zaporizhia regions, Kherson controlled by Murmansky governor from Murmansk region, and it's like a system, you know. For example, when they want to deport these children to Russia, they know how they want to do that, and in what especially territories and in what especially places they will deport these children. For example, they put children from Luhansk region, for example, from Kremenная district or from Svatovo district, and deported these children to Astrakhanska region or to Saratov region. Or, for example, they put children from occupied left bank of Zaporizhia region and put these children to Tatarstan or to Murmansk region. So it's like a planning system and planned policy how they
mm,
do especially, and all of that controlled by Russian governors especially.
mm. So what happens once, they are removed? How are they tracked administratively? And are there any special mechanisms that are used to prevent families from being able to locate or reclaim them?
I know that they only said to families that it's only to summertime or to like an excursion
Mm-hmm.
for some visiting to safe place. It's what they mentioned in official website. But what we know especially about a really practice that after that they don't want to come back these children to home.
Mm-hmm.
In many times they don't want to share, for example, to parents where these children really situated in Russian Federation.
Is there any way to track them through GPS or tracking devices or anything like that?
I know especially that in some cases they uh, cutting off phones and
Mm,
internet from children, and for
mm,
example children after that have no chance to connect with their parents or with their siblings.
mm. So, is there a difference with the way they treat young children and adolescents, especially in terms of indoctrination and what kind of military preparation they are going through?
Especially, I know that they have some different practice, to very young, small children, especially,
Mm-hmm,
yes, and for example, to teenagers, because, for example, when we talking about paramilitary practice.
mm-hmm,
For example, for very small children, for example, 3, 4, 5 years old, they creating a specifically organization named Eagles of Russia. Eagles of
mm,
Russia is only for small children. It's looks like plain lessons, but with Russia view especially. But it's like for child,
mm-hmm,
But especially if we're talking about paramilitary practice to teenagers. For
mm-hmm,
teenagers, it's like paramilitary lessons where when they study how to use weapon, for example,
mm-hmm.
how to use tactical medicine, how to throw a grenade, for example, and like this. And we have a lot of photos and videos from these paramilitary lessons. It's look like a young version of army.
Is there a difference between the way the Russian authorities are publicly describing their programs for their own domestic audience and what they're saying internally, or are they pretty much, telling their own population exactly what's going on?
Especially, I know that for Russian population, they said that it's like one nations, not
Mm-hmm,
different between Ukrainian and Russia. And for example, they don't make a difference between Ukrainian children from temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and with the children from Russian Federation. And they mixed these children in these summer camps. For
mm-hmm.
example, we know that, for example, they could include two young army children from Ukraine and children from Russia, and they have one lessons for this practice.
But has there been, to your knowledge, any discussion maybe on social media or in Russian elite circles about the fact that these children are basically being kidnapped from their families under false pretenses or by force? I mean, has there been any sort of concern about that from anyone in Russia?
I know especially that maybe in some opposite ways in Europe, maybe some Russian who are opposite
Mm-hmm,
to official Russian policy can tell about that, but
mm-hmm,
not in Russian Federation because
mm-hmm,
all Russian officials' website mentioned that it's not a deportation and militarization, that it's only evacuation and it's only an education. They don't want to mention about like war crimes, you know. They mentioned that not the war crimes, it's just our policy. But especially we know that it's war crimes because this practice look like war crimes, you know.
As the war progressed, have there been any changes to these programs? And also, once the international scrutiny became more visible, once this situation started became better known abroad, has there been any changes in the policies or the way the Russians are handling this?
I know especially what change that especially they try to flood it more and more, especially paramilitary cases. Earlier, they try in general to deport the children to Russia. Right now, they try to deport the children too, but creating these paramilitary groups not only near Ukrainian border, but in occupied territories of Ukraine too, and especially before full-scale invasion, they have, for example, young army branches only in occupied Donetsk city because Donetsk city occupied from 2014. But after 2022, they created this branch of paramilitary movement in all occupied cities, in occupied territories of Ukraine, in Melitopol, in Mariupol, in Berdyansk, in Henichesk, in left bank of Zaporizhia region, in all of these new occupied territories, they created these paramilitary groups. So for my decision, I think that it's like they try to flood it more and more, especially this paramilitary policy after full-scale invasion, and especially the last 2 years, what I mentioned.
There were some stories recently that I've heard about some of the children being moved to North Korea. Is there anything more information about that?
I hear about these stories. I don't know, or it's really true. Maybe it's they go only to excursion for North
Mhm,
Korea, but it can be. Why? It can be because we know, especially that some children removed too far east of Russia. And
mhm,
especially, I know that some children from occupied Mariupol city, removed by governor of Primorsky Krai Oleg Kazhemyako, they removed children from Mariupol city to far east, and
mhm,
far east, especially not so far from North Korea. So
mhm.
they have a chance maybe to go to some visiting or excursion to North Korea, I think.
So, in terms of the legal approach, how do investigators distinguish between forced evacuation, unlawful transfer, and outright abduction when assessing the removal of these children to either to Russian-controlled territories or to Russia itself?
It's only just OSINT practice. It's like you should analyze a lot and a lot sources from open
Mhm,
investigations, from Russian websites, from websites of occupied territories of Ukraine, administration who have some collaboration with Russian officials. You should try to find these ways, and it's very difficult. It's like a all day work, you know, to find especially this information.
Um, what sort of evidentiary standards are required to prove intent in cases involving this sort of systematic transfer and re-education, given that there is active armed conflict going on? How is that even possible to find individual, stories and kind of put together what happened?
Uh, Especially, we know that some of children have a successful story because they successfully returned to Ukraine right now. and we know especially at least 1,930 children who are returned to home, and in some cases they want to share their stories.
Mm-hmm.
Investigators try to put their names like anonymous,
Mm-hmm.
for their safety and
Mm-hmm.
for safety of their siblings. But especially we know this from life stories. For example, I have a few interviews with teenagers who are escaped from Russian Federation after deportation and who are escaped from occupied territories of Ukraine, and they said especially their stories about how Russia created these paramilitary lessons in occupied territories,
Mm-hmm.
how they try to deport children, and it's their real stories what they share for us as a researchers and human defenders.
And in terms of international humanitarian law, how does it define protected children in this context, and which conventions or legal frameworks are most directly implicated by these practices?
Especially, it's a violation against four Geneva Convention, and it's
Mm-hmm.
a violation against best interest of child, and
Mm-hmm.
especially violations like war crimes. And what I know from practice that Russian Federation must share to Ukraine, or if they don't want to share to Ukraine, to international partners, a list of these children who are forcibly deported to Russia, and asked Ukrainian governors if they want to come back these children to home. But we know that Russian Federation officials, they ignored this, and they don't want to share any list of children who are right now staying in Russian Federation.
So when you're documenting indoctrination after, either interviewing the children or just simply trying to understand these programs, are there any indicators which you underscore to separate cultural exposure, meaning once the kids are immersed in the environment, they naturally absorb what happens around them, versus coercive political or ideological reprogramming?
Practice from sometimes I'm analyzing interviews what we
Mm-hmm.
recorded with children. In other cases I have some books from Russian Federation and from occupied territories of Ukraine what I'm analyzing to cultural explosion and to propaganda especially, and how they try to improve Russian propaganda to these books in occupied territories of Ukraine. And in other cases, I'm have a different information from websites of this paramilitary movement about their lessons, have photo and videos about these paramilitary movements, and try to analyze all of this practice and why they do that. And after that, I'm creating my own analytic and my own reports about that, and try to mention all of evidence what I'm find in this process.
Is there any significant difference between the process of militarization that you're observing and child soldier recruitment? And to what extent are any of these children then placed on the battlefield?
I think it's it's one mission but different stages, because
Hmm.
before they try to re-educate children, they try to
Mm-hmm.
improve these paramilitary lessons,
Mm-hmm.
and when especially teenagers
Mm-hmm.
have 17, 18 years old, they put
Mm-hmm.
this into Russian recruitment office and said that you must join to Russian army after that. Because, for example, I know um, about one stories. It's a young man from occupied Donetsk city His name is Yushko. His family surname, especially Yushko, and right now he have an anonymous surname Orlov, like a
Mhm.
Russian surname, and especially in 2017, 2018, 2019, he growing up in occupied Donetsk city and joined to Young Army movement. And when he have 18 years old, he joined to Russian army, and right now he is a soldier, especially young man and soldiers in Russian army. So it's like a example how it works, you know.
Now, is there still an effort to use some organizations to create any plausible deniability that this is taking place, or has it become basically an open practice for Russia?
I think it's more looks like a open practice for Russia, and it's a usually practice for right now for Russia last maybe 4 years,
Hmm.
especially last 3.5 years after full-scale invasion, and it's a usual practice in occupied territories what was under occupation from 2014.
How can investigators then verify age, identity, and family ties if the records are being destroyed or altered or deliberately obscured in various ways? You mentioned names being changed and so forth.
Uh, it's like not very open information, you know. In some cases you try to find if we're talking about new occupied territories by Russia
Mm-hmm.
after full-scale invasion in 2022, you try to find information, for example, about schools and villages before full-scale invasion and before Russian occupation. And in sometimes you can find some list of children before Russian occupation. So after that, you try to compare and try to identify the children from these territories before occupation and after occupation, and where they are after that, after occupation.
There any human sources like whistleblowers or eyewitnesses who have been helpful in finding the locations of some of the children who disappeared?
It's just from own investigations. It's very
Mm-hmm.
hard because you know you have no list of concretic point of these
Mm-hmm.
concretic temporary accommodation centers. For example, I know that Yale University Humanitarian Lab, they have their own list and investigation. For example, Regional Center of Human Rights have their own list of these temporary accommodation centers in Russian Federation where staying children who are forcibly deported from Ukraine. And for example, from my own investigation, we try to find with my colleagues this point too in Russian Federation, where especially they creating these summer camps and where especially they creating these temporary accommodation centers. But it's just from own investigation. You know, you have no one list of these old centers, and plus to it, what is very hard that Russian officials they all time removed children from one place to another, so it's very hard to identify at one place, you know, because maybe few days later could create it another places.
Mm. So, how does this relocation process of children intersect with allegations of genocide and international law, especially the destruction of national identity?
Especially from international law, we know that in best interest of child, country who are like evacuate these children must to share for children
Mhm.
their own history, their own language. Because if we're talking about Ukrainian children, they must to have especially Ukrainian history, Ukrainian language, because it's very important to save their identity. If they don't have these lessons, if they have only Russian history and Russian language, it's could be very dangerous because it's like a erasing of their identity, and after that, creating in Ukrainian children Russian identity, and
Mhm.
it's a violation against humanitarian law, and it's violation against best interest of child, especially.
How do psychological coercion and dependency factor into legal assessments of consent or voluntariness for older children and adolescents?
I know that especially it's very hard in psychological consequences because especially children who are staying, for example, few years in these
Mhm.
summer camps or in these temporary accommodation centers, they have a like a problem with their mentality orientation and with their identification, especially who they are. It's
Mhm.
very hard for them to understand, or they're Ukrainians or they're Russians. It's very hard because in their young minds mixed all of these lessons, stories,
Mhm.
propaganda. It's very hard to children, for example, cutting off propaganda and real story, and especially. So that's why it's very hard to psychological and mentality health of these children after that.
Hmm. What challenges have you encountered when trying to collect testimony from children who returned and who've been subjected to extensive prolonged ideological conditioning or fed or fear-based compliance?
Especially what I know that in sometimes, especially it's what we know only from children who are successfully come back to Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't know another stories.
Mm-hmm.
What we know about the children who are successfully come back into Ukraine, they said they don't want to have any connection with Russian society, with Russian history, and with Russian mentality. But
Mm-hmm.
especially in another cases, for example, for EPT, children have a problem with the language. For example, it's very hard for them to have reasons between Ukrainian and Russian language, especially between Ukrainian and Russian history. It's a very big problem for them to like entrance after that to Ukrainian university, for example. Yes, because they have no chance to complete it Ukrainian program in school
Mm-hmm.
because they studied in occupied territory or in Russia, and it's a lot of this problem to children, but we have special programs in different humanitarian organization who are help for these children with that, and who are help, for example, children from who are successfully come back in from deportation. They help these children to complete Ukrainian educational courses, for example, and to entrance to Ukrainian university, to find their own place in Ukrainian society, and like this.
Mm-hmm. Um, would you say that these guardianship or adoption programs complicated the effort to classify these acts as war crime, or does it not really make a difference?
I think it's war crime too, for my mind, because it's
Mhm.
like a violation against best interest of child, and it's a rising of identity of these children, because children have a very young age, and
Mhm.
they have no chance, especially mm, how they how they can escape, for example, from this policy, because it's especially considered adoption, especially considered with very young child, especially it's 3, 5, 6 years old. So it's very dangerous for these children because they can be adopted by Russian families and growing up like Russians, not Ukrainian children.
Mhm. Cases of children coming back, I understand that they were mediated and negotiated through diplomatic channels. What did Russians get out of releasing these children? After all, they're giving up leverage. They're giving up. The whole point was to get these children, to train them to become future child soldiers or supporters of the Russian military objectives. And also, they're witnesses to what's going on, so they can provide information. So, why were they ultimately released?
I don't know how to answer about this concretic, because it's a different cases.
Mm-hmm,
We very different cases. What I'm talking about earlier, because sometimes after come back in these children to home, Russian officials have not to share any information after that. In some cases, they sharing information that especially it's a big problem to these children because Ukrainian don't want to support these children and they have no chance, to join for Ukrainian society because they try to cutting off Ukrainian society and Ukrainian society in occupied territories of Ukraine. They try to put this problem between Ukrainians, and it's a very big problem.
No, I meant, why did the Russians finally release some of those children? After all, for them, it's not an advantage. Why did they agree? In the cases when children came back,
Why they don't what
why
doing?
why did the Russians release some of the children? Why did the Russians return some of the children?
Why they return some of the children? It's how it's explained. They have no official policy to return these children to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm,
It's like only diplomatical issues, and
mm-hmm,
it's a very hard process, especially. And for example, Human Defenders Society
mm-hmm,
have no information officially about that. I know just about a few cases
mm-hmm,
that come back in some children through Qatar, from Qatar to European countries, and from European countries to Ukraine. And
mm-hmm,
another cases I know that, for example, parents go to Russia and taking children from summer camps, and after that escaping from Russia to Baltic countries, and from Baltic country to Poland, and from Poland to Ukraine, like this. But
mm-hmm,
it's not like officially practice,
mm-hmm.
So that's why it's so small numbers of children who are successfully returned, because it's very hard practice, and uh, especially what I know that Russian officials don't want to come back these children to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It's like just some cases how they can come back, but it's very hard. It's all what I know about that, about comebacking children to home.
So what happens once they return? Is there some sort of an official process where they're evaluated, where they're debriefed? Is there a counseling process, a deprogramming process, or do they just come back straight to their families or placed into new orphanages?
Uh, especially in Ukraine, human rights defenders organization and Office of Ombudsman of Ukraine, they have rehabilitation programs, a big rehabilitation programs to these children. They have good educational programs for these children, how they can in future integrate to Ukrainian society and to Ukrainian educational system, for example. It's especially what I know, but I don't know especially about detail of this rehabilitation because
Mhm,
I don't include to this process, because I'm only investigate process of war crimes.
mhm. So, getting back to that, how can investigators balance the need for accountability with the psychological protection of child witnesses?
I know that especially some human rights organization who
Mhm,
are especially involved in the process of returning children to home, they have own psychological team
mhm,
and especially educational team who are still working with these children after that. But I'm don't involved in this process.
mhm. Are there any historical precedents, examples from other or previous conflicts that are relevant in assessing the forced assimilation of children as a tool of war, or that can be useful to figure out how to deal with this situation?
It's We have some historical examples, but not so large,
Mhm,
like this practice. But especially, I know about historical precedents like policy of Lebensborn. It's
mhm,
from Nazi Germany, especially in World War II times. They forcibly deported some Polish children to Germany, and
mhm,
after that re-educate these children like Germans,
mhm,
like German nations. It looks like as what Russian officials doing right now, but especially what I know that in modern time in this Ukrainian-Russian war is more large process, and we don't know when it can be stopped.
mhm. Another question is, there's been many conflicts recently where there were child soldiers recruited by terrorist organizations and also by state actors as well. Have are you working with other countries who've had that experience recently as maybe as a joint advocacy or joint legal process to address those issues?
Especially in Georgetown University, I have colleagues who have experience to and used to work earlier in Bosnia, in Angola, in Rwanda, and they
Mhm,
know about the children issues in war conflict. And especially, it's very helpful when we try to create some advocacy policy and how to share this
mhm,
problem of children in war conflict uh, right now in example of Ukraine to international society and how we can defend Ukrainian children. And this special experience from colleagues are very helpful for me.
Do you see do you see any possibility of sort of remedies for victims and the families in terms of post-war efforts? Are there any particular pathways that you're exploring for the future?
I think after war, I hope we should create it some helpful, uh, maybe like a metodical books and especially advocacy policy how we should defend children in war conflict, so they have no chance to be victims of these war crimes after
Mhm.
that. And I think that Ukrainian experience can be very helpful. It's very tragical experience for APT, but it can be very helpful to create this methodical policy and to create these advocacy issues to international society after that.
Are there any third-party states who have been assisting Russia with this? For instance, Belarus.
Earlier, I know in 2022, when Russian troops come from Belarus to Kiev region
Mhm.
and fighting near Kiev city, they forcibly deported some children to Belarus, and
Hmm.
especially in Minsk and Vitebsk region of Belarus, they created summer camps too, and some of children staying in these summer camps in Belarus Republic. But after that, what I am know that some part of these children removed to Russia after that, from Belarus to Russia.
Is there any way to compel, these states to cooperate, like Belarus, for instance, given that Russia is obviously denying access to information? Is there any way to put pressure on any of Russian allies to help?
Especially, I think what can be maybe helpful in this is improving and international sanctions,
Mm-hmm.
especially personal, international, economical sanctions against Russian governors. And a lot of that already have these sanctions from USA, from EU, from Great Britain. I know that a lot of them have these international sanctions, but for a pity, some of them don't have these sanctions. But I think it's maybe just one way how we can find these perpetrators and have some responsible from these perpetrators to that.
Now, I know that there were some individual Russian officials who were sanctioned, top level officials, spokespeople, people who basically boasted about it, about on state media. But what about other types of perpetrators, such as educators, social workers, medical personnel, who are basically acting under state directors? Has there been an effort to identify who those people are based on children's accounts or based on the knowledge of particular facilities or social media or other information, and to essentially create some international accountability mechanisms, such as sanctions, such as uh, freezing them out of the international financial system, things like that?
Yes, it can be international sanctions too. I think it can be like a freezing of bank accounts of
Mm-hmm.
the perpetrators, and it can be maybe criminal procedure against them. Because if we have a chance to identify it, these people, for example, teachers who re-educate children to Russian standards of education, or for example, medical personnel who are sharing a list to Russian officials and after that deported children from occupied territories to Russia, it can be like a criminal procedure against them.
Mm-hmm. Finally, what do you think, in your opinion, justice could or should look like for children who've been repatriated but cannot fully recover their original identity, language, or family ties? What would justice mean in this context?
Especially what justice can be in what?
In a what would justice look like for children who have been repatriated or are going to be repatriated back to Ukraine, but cannot fully recover their identity, language, or family ties? What if their family members have been killed or injured or cannot be found?
I think it's can be only in one way from strongly support of Ukrainian society and
Mm-hmm,
especially international society because for a pity, but it's not a problem of these children. They
mm-hmm,
have no chance.
mm-hmm,
They just live in territories of Ukraine, what occupied by Russian officials, by Russian troops, and they have no chance, for example, in sometimes to escape from this
mm-hmm.
situation. So that's why if we come back in these children to home to Ukraine, they must have opinion that Ukrainians support them and they want to help for them. Especially they want to integrate them to Ukrainian society and help for them with anything in their life.
Finally, what do you think more can be done or needs to be done to get more international awareness, more international pressure, and essentially raise the level of outrage that this situation deserves, and to kind of counter the apathy, the propaganda, the economic discussions that seem to have come to the forefront of the current, focus?
I think it's maybe can be like a creating of international opinion of different international partners that can said that it's like a crimes. Russian officials' policy right now, Russian officials' educational system, and the Russian system of how they try to re-educate children and how they try to change Ukrainian children. It's maybe creating maybe some documents in international law level, maybe like this. And after that, it's especially international sanctions only this way, I think.
What happens with the children who cannot reintegrate, who are older, who've been completely brainwashed? I remember there was one story of one teenager who left when he was 15, came back when he was 18, and he was already completely indoctrinated and was engaged in combat. What happens in those cases?
Um, I don't know. I think nobody knows what we can do with that, but I think we should try especially to help for these children. But if they don't want for that, it's for a pity a big problem after war in Ukraine with this part of society from these children who are growing up in occupied territories, but maybe we can think in and creating some specific policy what we should do with that because for right now I think nobody have one position what do with what can do with children for example who don't want to reintegrate, yes, because it's very hard issues for right now. Maybe after war we can create in some policy about that.
And do you have a tip line, a way for people who maybe want to share information anonymously or somehow connect to provide information about the children who are being, who've been disappeared? Are there ways for people who do want to do that, maybe to connect, or some incentives to encourage um, some sort of basic civic consciousness, even among, Russians in Russia or people living in the occupied territories?
I think maybe for have an answer for this question, we just must to stop a war, and maybe after that we can create it something, because right now we have no position about occupied territories, because from time to time it's most city under Russian occupation. Some city can be free from Ukrainian army, yes, and we don't know especially where will be this top line of
Sure.
territory. Only after that we can understand how we can move in future with this policy, how we can help, for example, people. Maybe some people want to for example left these territories and go to Ukraine after that, but we don't
Mm-hmm.
know right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for this insightful discussion, and I think many people who may have heard something a little bit about this, but overall have no idea what's going on. I think anyone, with basic, conscience is going to be horrified to understand exactly what's going on and the scale of what's happening, which is massive, and the psychological burden and the psychological trauma that it places on the entire Ukrainian society, and of course on the children who are affected by this separation from their families, from their communities and homes. I hope that we can amplify the story and bring a lot more attention and a lot more help to finding a solution as soon as possible.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for your interest in and supporting Ukrainian children and supporting these issues, because it's very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I hope anyone watching it will continue following Vladislav's work and following, of course, this issue in general. And maybe if you have any ideas of how to help, or if you want to volunteer your skills and your expertise, of course, please be in touch with him and his colleagues. Every little bit helps. For those who watched us, thank you so much for joining, and we'll be back next week, of course, Tuesday night, 9 p.m., as always, the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.